All right, students of Rome, we are back, and I'm starting to regret saying that this would be a shorter lecture, but it really will be. Like, it's going to be fine. So, we are on the second pillar of our Roman series, and in this little lecture, we are going to talk about the government and social classes of Rome in a very superficial way. But what we're going to, so let me preface this all by saying that a lot of the history that we know of early Rome and the rise of the Republic is passed down to us by Roman authors who themselves were not necessarily working from the archaeological record. They weren't using kind of scientific methods to determine timelines, chronology, this sort of thing. So, all the talk about kings, for instance, we don't really have any sort of um, serious evidence that they existed. We know about them from Roman sources. Much, which brings us to the idea that some of the history that we are talking about here is actually kind of invented, is a sort of mythology. And it'd be wonderful if we could kind of talk about that more and like what that means and the relation of truth to all of this. But given our limited resources, limited time, we're going to take the word of the Romans when they describe their history, because at the end of the day, whether or not this actually specifically happened, the fact is that the Romans believe this about themselves. So when we talk about how the city thought of itself, how it imagined its politics, we know that these were the sorts of things that they were considering as they imagined themselves, as they visualized their own city. So with that caveat, the Romans told themselves, the story we have from the Romans themselves is that the first government of Rome was a monarchy, and that from the 8th to the 6th centuries, so from 799 to 508 BCE, Rome was governed by a series of kings. The first three of these kings are fascinating. They all have kind of these big mythological features, like the lawgiver, the philosopher, the bridge maker. Like they're amazing. And there's a lot of resources about them if you would like to read about them. Um, but they were kings. We know that Rome was governed, according to the Romans, by a single figure or under a kingship, just like Mesopotamian cities and just like the Hellenistic monarchies, right? Some of the kings have Etruscan names, Tarquin. This is an Etruscan name, and so we assume that they were considered to be Etruscan, and some had Latin names. So Servius Tullius, that is a Roman Latin name. So there's this mixture in the very early history of Rome of Etruscan and Latin governance. But as this point says, most, if not all, that is known about them is legend. Archaeology suggests that some centralized power was making meaningful changes in the city of Rome. Um, so, so something was happening. Whether or not it was a king or some other thing, we know that around 600 to 500 BCE, there was some centralized power because the Forum, which is here in this picture, if you see this picture, beyond the pillars where all these little people are, that's the Roman Forum. And this area, which would have been kind of low-lying swamp land, was paved. And there were the building of palaces as well. And one thing our book doesn't talk about, but that Livy talks about that is really interesting. Livy is a historian that we're not going to read, but he's great if you're looking for the Roman historian par excellence. Livy talks a lot about the cloaca, which is the Roman sewer system. And it sounds gross, and we don't like to talk about it all the time, but a way of getting waste out of the city and so that people could stay healthy and okay. This is a really important part of building the city. And so the cloaca was also built around this time. The reason we know that a centralized power is required for that sort of building project is because imagine if you wanted to build a huge sewer moving human waste out of your neighborhood. How many people do you think would just voluntarily get together for that, right? So it's you need a central figure to kind of arrange these building projects. So that is why we know that something was going on in terms of government, whether it be kings or something else. The Romans themselves said it was the result of kings. Yes, in this period as well, even this king period, there rose the concept of imperium. And I want to talk about this because it's an important feature of Rome throughout its history. But also you can tell by the word fasces, it's a concept that we think about a lot now. And I think it's just interesting to kind of know where these concepts arose. So our book you defines imperium as the concept of a divine authority through which a Roman leader exercised power in not only political but also military and religious matters. Excuse me. I've been having I think it's the weather. So imperium, it is the power to rule, right? There's a sense of divine support. So if you say you have Imperium, you are essentially saying the gods have blessed you with the power to lead not only the city itself, but also its military, and as we will talk about, religious matters. So if you have an Imperium in Rome, if you have Imperium, which typically only one or two people could hold at a time, you had the power to rule the people, the military, and the priests. And it's interesting thinking about this from the perspective of Alexandria. So in Alexandria, the king had the power over the city and the military, but as you may recall, in Egypt in particular, the kings, the Ptolemies, really had to struggle with the priesthood because the king's authority, that spear-held land authority, did not extend to religion. Whereas in Rome, imperium does include religion. And Augustus himself, I believe, at one point is the Pontifex Maximus. Like there's an idea that even religion is subordinate to the leader of the state in Rome. That is the breadth, that is the reach of imperium. So imperium is a concept that Livy and other Roman historians attribute to the kings. The kings held imperium. But when the kings are abolished, it is the consuls, so the two elected leaders of the republic, they themselves hold imperium. And then by the time we get to the emperors are the holders of imperium. But by the time we get to the emperors, the concept of imperium has gotten a little bit more diffuse. And um, yes, and it's kind of like Rome itself has imperium over other peoples. It's part of how Rome justifies its empire project. But that is for another class. I do believe there's also a book called Imperium by I think Robert Harris, maybe, but I haven't read that one yet. It's on the list. So that, and of course, the word empire comes from this, right? They're the same. They're the same word. But so how does fasces fit into this? Now here, this is an original fasces. So fasces is this bundle of rods, which rods is just a fancy word for thick sticks. So it's a bundle of rods that are wrapped around the handle of an axe. And so what would happen is that the bodyguards of the people holding Imperium, the bodyguards, not the people themselves, but the bodyguards of the people holding Imperium would carry this axe with the fasces wrapped around it, as a way of scaring people. Like so that's the what the original term fasces came from. And as Rome progressed, so this started out probably as a very practical weapon, as a way of like keeping people off of the leader. Um, why the rods tied around? I mean, maybe it's to distinguish it from a normal axe. So you're not just a guy holding an axe, you're a guy holding fasces, so therefore it's okay. It's not really clear to me why. I don't think anyone's ever really gotten to the bottom of that. But this becomes an incredibly in the Roman Republic and Empire, it becomes a stylized sort of symbol. So there would still be a bodyguard around Augustus holding this axe with rods around it, but it would be beautiful. It would have beautiful ribbons around it. And it was more of just a symbol of power. And so it's interesting to think like now we have certain things, right, that kind of symbolize certain governments. And for some reason, the only thing I can think of right now is Air Force One. But like that's kind of a symbol of the presidency. I don't know. Anyhow, but so that's where the word fasces comes from. The word fascism, as we talk about it today, is related to the fact that Mussolini in the 20th century used this symbol, the fasces, for himself as a way of expressing his particular ideology. So that's where it comes from. All right. So That is, so that's the government at first. Kings, imperium, fasces. But even during the time of kings, there was a sort of republican government in Rome. Citizens still had a voice. And Roman citizens themselves, the concept of citizenship was more important in Rome and also more flexible than it was in any of the other cities that we've looked at. So you can see our book here says Rome was more open about extending her citizen body than any other city of the ancient world. To the astonishment of the Greeks, even the descendants of freed slaves would become citizens as a matter of course. So a Roman slave would often be freed by his owner. Really consistently. There's a word called manumission. It was a very common thing in Rome. And so the result was a citizen body that grew rapidly. So, a Roman citizen had a voice in government and was also expected to be part of its army, which is part of the reason that Rome really wanted to increase its citizen base because it increased the amount of people who could be in the army. But from its very outset, Rome, it was very easy to become a citizen in Rome, as opposed to Athens. In Athens, you had to be born from a citizen to become a citizen, right? It was not possible. There was no other path. And as you may remember when we talked about Alexandria, scholars have claimed that this very limited citizen body is the reason that a Greek city-state couldn't thrive because it just got smaller and smaller rather than bigger and bigger. Because citizenship in Rome was more easily granted, the citizen body grew and it made the city stronger by all historical accounts. So, how did Roman citizens vote? Like, why is this important? So, our book describes it. It's a little bit arduous to go through, but as I mentioned, if you were a Roman citizen, you were also a soldier in the Roman army. Like, that was just a one-to-one. Women could be citizens, and at various points throughout Roman history, the power of women in government kind of waned and then waxed, grew, but they were never soldiers. So even if they were citizens in a certain respect, they were never voting citizens. So the citizens, just like soldiers in the army, were divided into what were called centuries. And here the word century just means 100. Interesting fact, though the word century means 100, we think there's only 97 people in each one. Like it was almost a century, but it was never quite 100. It was always 97. But so all citizens, there's all the citizens of Rome, but each one of them belonged in a century, and you were placed in a century on the basis of how much money you had or how much wealth you had. And the wealth was measured by the amount of armor you could afford. So some centuries, the smallest number of centuries, included the citizens that could afford both armor and a horse and maybe a carriage. The second biggest group of centuries would have included people who could just afford armor and maybe one horse. The majority of the centuries was composed of citizens who could afford like part of a uniform, right? The poorest people, they were still Roman, they were still citizens, but they were in centuries that indicated that they were not rich. And then it was on the basis of those groups that people could vote. And so the richest centuries got to vote first. They had the most power. And the lowest centuries voted last, had the least amount of power. So it was still a representative government, but the rich had a much bigger, louder, more powerful voice than did the poor. So as you could see here, this council, this group of citizen voters, they could initially vote on war, peace, and changes to the Constitution, which is weird because I know about the Constitution. No, we don't have to worry about it. Ultimately, when the Republic is founded, the centuries would vote on the consul. So every year a new consul was elected. The centuries are the people who elected him. And the richer, so there you go. They eventually got more powers under the Republic. So that is how the Republican government worked. But to a certain extent, this Republican government existed under kings, and it had the name Comitia Centuriata, which basically just means the Committee of Centuries, and they had some voice in government from the beginning, including under kings. And it just kind of grew as the Roman Republic grew. So, We have kings. They had some sort of Republican government underneath them. That Republican government was based on the citizenship body, and the citizen body was constantly growing. At a certain point, the kings were replaced, and they were replaced by the republic. Now, the way this happened is very uncertain. We have historical representations of it. So there's one story in which the republic was brought into play because a woman here named Lucretia was raped by the son of a king. And that so infuriated the peoples of Rome that they rose up and drove out the kings. Another story, a less known story, but nevertheless a story, is about this guy here. So this is a painting. It's called Horatio on the Bridge, and it's about this hero, Horatius, who defends Rome. He holds a bridge from incoming attacks. He becomes a hero, and he is somehow responsible for the rise of the Republic. So there's different versions of the story. They are all somewhere between true and false, somewhere between myth and history. But we do know that eventually the Republic was created. And so the Republic, our book mentions why it's a republic and not a radical democracy. So to think of democracy, we have Athens. And if you remember Athens, all of the citizens would come together and they would like raise their hands on things and they would count the people's hands and be like, well, 50 people like this and 47 people don't. So we will do it because the majority wins, right? And they would do that with everything, for better or for worse. Because there were so many citizens in Rome, it became impractical, impossible to have a simple majority based on voting of all of the citizens. Hence the creation of the centuries and the system of representative government rather than radical democracy. So originally it was under the kings, but even under the Republic for a very long time, it was the ruling families because they were in charge of the most powerful centuries that had control. Um, and it's important to remember that. Well, it's not really important for this class. At the beginning of the Republic, it was a representative democracy, but the aristocratic families basically had their thumb on the scale, right? They still had the most power. There were two consuls. These are basically the two leading men, and they are the men who held imperium. But what's interesting is that they only held power for 1 year and could not serve in consecutive years. So you see here a real concern about a specific individual gaining too much power for too long a period of time, which would argue for some sort of fear of kings, fear of singular rulers. The consular system is meant to guarantee that no single person can hold power for a significant amount of time. This worked. It worked for a long time until it didn't work at all. But this was how the Romans set it up. The consuls themselves were elected by the centuries. This whole time, there has been a Senate. And I don't think this comes up in this lecture, but because I can't resist, I will tell you the word Senate basically just means old man. Senatus, senex, this word means old man. And from the jump, the Senate was a bunch of old guys, a group of advisors to the king. So that is how the Senate arose. So if you think about Mesopotamian cities, and poor Enkidu. So Gilgamesh had a bunch of advisors. So too, theoretically, did the Roman kings. Those advisors were called the Senate. They went through some changes during the Republic, but ultimately they became a vast reservoir of collective experience and was to provide an impressive stability and continuity in Roman government. So the Senate got some specific powers. It became powerful in its own right. Um, yeah, so that's the Senate. There were many other offices. This is the sort of thing where you would take a Roman history class to learn about the like cursus honorum, the many levels of officers. But there were other offices. Some of them were elected, some of them were appointed. So yeah, so that is the Republic. So I think I'm going to stop here and we will come back in the next lecture and talk about patricians versus plebes and women. I'm pretty sure. I'm excited about that. Okay, so I'll see you in a bit or a long time. But I hope to see you soon.